Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Poketown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be putting Mew VMAX in the spotlight for the World Championships 2023 in Yokohama. This is a pretty well-established archetype, and the strategy revolves around the amount of draw power this archetype has, with the multiple Genesect V on the board, all with their Fusion Strike system abilities, allowing you to cycle constantly through your deck as you play out your cards. That's why you'll see a really high density of item cards in the Mew archetype, because you want to constantly lower your hand size so you can then top up with multiple Genesects throughout the turn. If that's not enough, you have Guaranteed Tutor from Forest Sealstone once a game, and Cramomatics on coin flips can allow you to directly access any card in your deck as well. So the cornerstone of this archetype is that you can construct some crazy turns and can rely on non-draw supporters throughout the majority of the game because you draw so many cards through your Pokemon alone. Now, Mew VMAX is a pretty vulnerable 3-prize Pokemon, especially with a decent amount of Dark type coverage in the format right now, but you can try and use either Technoblast for big uptrade potential, but you can also jump back into your deck with your Mew V as well. So you're not always representing a vulnerable 3-prize Pokemon in every situation of the game, and at that same time, you can always be throwing Disruption supporters at the opponent to try and throw them off their game as you try and top up on cards throughout the game yourself, making sure that you don't ever miss a beat. That's the main idea. At the same time, this deck has one of the most explosive turn 1 going second combinations out of any deck in the format right now, thanks to the Alessa Sparkle supporter, allowing us to pull 2 Fusion Strike energy out of our deck and put them onto 2 of our Fusion Strike Pokemon. This allows us to unlock the attacks of Meloetta as well as Ice Cube. Meloetta is the bread and butter if we are trying to hit through V Pokemon, because with 3 Fusion Strike energy, that's 2 from the Sparkle and 1 from your turn attachment, plus 1 Power Tablet or 1 Choice Belt, you're knocking out every V in formats, which is fantastic with that Melodious Echo. Even if you don't use Melodious Echo on turn 1 going second, having this option in your deck throughout the mid-game, and even if you just bank a Fusion Energy somewhere on your board, it means that Melodious Echo, with a Sparkle attachment later on, can reach that 280 threshold as well if you have access to all 4 of your Fusion Strike energy, so then you're just a tablet or 2 away from dealing with pretty much everything in format. So Meloetta is your higher damage output threat that you have available thanks to the Alessa Sparkle. Ice Cube's a little bit trickier. It has the Block Slider option, which does a very similar thing to the Meloetta, but rather than 70x the Fusion Energy to the active, it's 40 times, but can also hit benched Pokemon at the same time. This allows us to get around the Spiritomb tech card. That's a really big thing that players are using against Mew these days. You could try and use that Block Slider attack, or even use Mew's Crush Fusion Strike to copy Ice Cube to spread onto a Spiritomb and knock it out. Many decks don't actually play Recovery for their Spiritomb, so once you've dealt with it once, it can be done for good, but also this deck plays Lost City to make sure that's the case. No deck is going to be playing more than 1 Spiritomb, you would think, so Lost Citying a Spiritomb once in the game means it's just done for good, and then you can carry on drawing cards throughout the entire game. I'll also notice that the Fusion Strike energy already gives you some coverage against Spiritomb, because you can bank these Fusion Energy onto Genesects, and every Genesect that has a Fusion Energy is no longer being affected by Spiritomb's ability, so that Genesect exactly can continue to use Fusion Strike system. The Ice Cube Lost City combination isn't just for Spiritomb though. This can also be a really nice option for you at dealing with the likes of Gardevoir players, and to some extent as well Lost Box players, where you can take out threatening Pokemon and make sure they're gone for good. So this is a really nice option to have in the deck at the same time. Onto a skeleton list, and it's pretty well fleshed out. That's because we're cramming a lot into this list. This is 57 cards right now, and we are trying to play an aggressive game with the Sparkles and the Fusion Energy, but also have enough defensive tools in the deck as well to see us through to the mid-game. That's why you are seeing Powpad plus Iono and Judge in the deck, so that when we have to, we can be playing a much more disruptive game plan. There's even 1 copy of Path to the Peak. This can be really useful alongside Iono in particular for slowing down Gardevoir players, slowing down the Mirror Match, slowing down Chien-Pao decks. A lot of things get covered by Path to the Peak, of course, especially when you put your opponent down to that lower hand size. So the deck does have defensive dimensions, but it still has that emphasis of aggression when it needs to. You see a ton of Ball Search in here. That's because the Fusion Strike system gets better the more Pokemon you get into play. We have those Power Tablets and Choice Belts, as well as Cleansing Gloves, to give us a decent amount of damage mods. The Cleansing Gloves helps out against the Gardevoir matchup, helps out in Mirror, but also allows us to use Psychic Leap more effectively into Lost Zone matchups as well. So you're never giving up a VMAX Pokemon. Sometimes you're leaping into a Genesect that doesn't have that Dark weakness. Sometimes you're leaping into an Ice-Q or a Meloetta just to give up a single prize, or sometimes you're just leaping into another Mew and saying that a 2-prize knockout is far less bad than a 3-prize knockout, at the very least, knowing that the Mew can evolve if it's not dealt with immediately. So the Cleansing Gloves helps in that endeavor, because oftentimes you're reducing that 70 base damage with double turbo energy. So slapping a Cleansing Gloves on puts you back into range of knocking out Comphase straight away with Psychic Leap. So a decent amount of damage mod, so we can power through things when we need to. Early game aggression is available via the Sparkle, and because we just draw so many cards, even though there's only 2 copies of boss in the deck, when you have your Forest Seal Stones, your Crams, and that many Genesects drawing you cards, you hit those bosses and make sure that you're hitting the targets that you want to throughout the game. That's the whole emphasis of this archetype. Let's have a look at the matchup spread for Mew, and it's a really interesting one in this day and age. You have a decent number of good favourables. The Chien-Pao Baxcalibur deck, I'm really surprised by this one, because you would think on paper that Chien-Pao is a 2-prize Pokemon that can upgrade very, very easily, but it turns out that Mew's just raw aggression, consistency, and disruptive like late game options puts it pretty favourable against Chien-Pao. It also seems to be very good into the Rapid Strike deck. That one's a pretty obvious one, especially if people are net decking the NAIC winning list that has no tech cards for Mew whatsoever. You're pretty good at racing against Miraidon players, and you're not too phased by Ting-Lu either. Again, the Fusion Energy can chip in, so you can continue to draw cards with Genesect, and suddenly they are really just a low damage output deck that does nothing against you. For the even matchups, we have the Arctina. I would imagine most Arctina decks, and actually the unfavourable matchup on this list, the Arc Dura Umbreon for the most part, I imagine both of these decks will be teching Spiritomb for the World Championships. I think for these 2 decks in particular, their loss condition in many cases is that they just get blown up by early aggression, and if you develop a Spiritomb early as the Arceus player in most of these cases, you're going to be pretty well safeguarded around that, able to evolve into your V-Star Pokemon, and just have too much hit points for these Mew players to get through. And as soon as Arceus decks get established onto the board, start creeping into the game, they're going to have a really good time. So the Arctina is difficult because they have Path and Judge and Spiritomb, so getting around all of those combination of disruption is not very easy for the Mew players. We have Gardevoir, which is a pretty balanced matchup. You are playing those Lost Cities and the Ice-Q to try and make it better on your side of things. Those are like specific tech cards for one of the most popular decks in the game, but it's still a pretty balanced one. You're pretty okay into Giratina Lost Box. It's pretty close. The Goodra, surprisingly, as well, is an even matchup. The Lugia matchup, even though they have a ton of dark type attackers in their deck list, only one of those dark type attackers is a single prize Pokemon, so you are still able to construct multi-prize turns pretty much every turn of the game as the Mew player, which is good for you. Just have to be a little bit aware of their V-Guard energy as well, because that could push you out of KO range in certain instances, or make you go hunting for those Power Tablets. The Charizard Lost Box, also a pretty balanced one. They're pretty much known for playing Drapion, as is the sort of Turbo Lost Box. This one's also a bit of a slightly unfavourable, as is the United Wings deck. They, of course, represent decent dark type coverage with their Murkrows themselves. And the least favourable on here is the Arc Duraludon Umbreon. Like I said with the Arctina, this is very likely to be playing Spiritomb. It's also got type coverage via the Umbreon, and it will often play V-Guard Energy as well, so it can try and push the Umbreon out of range of being KO'd very easily by the Mew players. So I do think this is pretty obvious as to why this is quite an awkward one. They don't necessarily play a huge amount of Path to the Peak themselves. They're typically just running their own Lost Cities as well, but just that type coverage and the size of these Umbreons is the real concern overall. And they can try and be defensive with Duraludon as well and just sort of close out those last couple of prize cards, because the deck now plays a ton of Gust via the Umbreon, via the boss's orders themselves. They really do close the game out in like 3 attacks and that's it. So it's difficult for Mew to race. It really puts a strain on the amount of tablets that you're able to find turn by turn. Onto the tech options then. We were a little bit light on Ball Search in the skeleton list. Some people do play as low as that count that I did show, but oftentimes you'll see sometimes Hisuian Heavy Ball or Feather Ball add to the overall Ball Search counts that I showed. Even if they are just 1 counts in the deck list, it's again adding to the overall goal, which is to go wide on the board on those opening stages, because that's what makes Genesect Genesect, you know, that's what makes it do its thing and start drawing bring through the deck. Trekking Shoes can also be found in the list as well, just giving you an extra push in those opening turns, giving you some extra percentages. And also, we always have to remember, because we play Cramorant in the deck, we always want a high ratio of item cards in the deck, because at any point these cards could be fodder for a Cram on the hope of finding a crucial card at the right moment. Speaking of which, on the top of the screen here, we have the Fan of Waves. This can be a great way to get rid of the V-Guard energy from Lugia and Arctina players. It can also be used in a high roll situation on turn 1, going second into Arc decks that found their double turbo energy. If you're able to remove that straight away, even if you're not taking a KO in that instance, you're just in a really good spot against them. Echoing Horn, similarly, is very good against some of these V-Star matchups, because usually we are spending so many tablets getting through 280 hit point Pokemon that we then need to find easier Gust prizes towards the later stages. Once we're out of tablets, we can simply go for Echoing Horn Gust plays instead and use the likes of our belts to get over the line. Silene can do another similar thing here. You are flipping coins, which never feels good, but sometimes just getting that extra copy of Power Tablet, getting back one of your tool cards can be absolutely huge. Even in some cases, Silening back a Fusion Energy so that you can still get a high power Melodious Echo can be massive for you. So this is a card that has sort of fallen out of favor as of late and was kind of seen more so in the double turbo builds of Mew that had a bit more space for this card, but it does give you some really interesting plays that your opponent may not expect, because it gives you a +1 on resources in most situations. There are a couple other supporters that could be sneaking in as well. Avery can be very good again against the Gardevoir players and other setup based decks, also a pain for the Chen Pao players at times, and good in the mirror match, so does have a few reasons why it's a pretty solid card. The Penny is more of a tech card for Lost Zone box, where you're trying to use that Psychic Leap going into your Mews, going into your Genesects, and hoping that they just have a Sableye play or a Cramorant hit or something along those lines, and then you can remove that damage altogether with a Penny option, which can be pretty interesting. Deoxys is also a pretty cool single prize attacking mon that can get into the mix here with that 120 hit points staying out of Cram range. So there are situations where you can get a Sparkle off, get your turn attachment of double turbo so that you can get a full power photon boost and you're knocking through one prize Pokemon easily, or you can even tablet your way up to multi prizes as well. Onto a no thrills 60 then. There's really not much else in here. We've just added to the ball search. We've added the Feather Ball as well as a third copy of Nest Ball. I do feel like these are quite valuable cards to have. Like I said, if you're not getting your Fusion Strike system going, the deck does just sputter. So just giving yourself more outs towards your basics is a really big deal. I did also want to touch on a build that's a little bit more aggressive in that it is playing the Echoing Horn now, and it is playing a secondary copy of Choice Belt. Yes, you're a little bit light on the ball search in this occasion, but just having that push potential to really maximize your outs against V-Star matchups. You know, Arc is still really popular, and I'm expecting it to be popular for Worlds, and we are seeing an uptick in Giratina Lost Box specifically, so having more V-based damage output with the extra belt and having the horn to pick off a evolving V Pokemon in the sort of mid to late game can be massive. There is a small anti-synergy of Lost City and Echoing Horn, so be a little bit aware of that, because sometimes you'll be zoning Pokemon rather than putting them in the discard pile when you knock them out. So be a little bit aware of that. You do have vacuums that can even get rid of your own Lost City at times, but Echoing Horn is still a really nice option to have in this deck to carve out easier prize maps and win in as few turns as possible. For my closing thoughts then, there's really no shortage of Mew tech cards, so your day may come down to coming up against which techs in which decks. So it's not really about what matchups you want to dodge necessarily, outside of trying to dodge Arctura Umbreon, I would expect. It's much more about what tech cards you come up against, and you may not realize what techs you're facing, you know, until you're midway through the game and realize they do have that Drapion that takes the last 3 prize cards that beats you. So you're kind of going to be on the edge of your seat with Mew at times throughout the day, which is a real worry. Every single time you sit down against someone, you may just be up against the person who's tired of losing to Mew one too many times and threw in that tech card as their last slot for the World Championships. There's no shortage of people who like to put in a tech card just to get a free win on the day. You know, you can only take 2 losses in the tournament, and just having, you know, a much higher chance of 1 win on 1 round, even if you only expect to face 1 Mew in day 1, many people might consider that to be a valuable tech inclusion, especially because Spiritomb has other percentages in other matchups as well. From my own expectation for the World Championships, and if I was someone looking to play Mew, I would expect Arctinas and Arcduras to both be playing Spiritomb, and I would expect almost all Lost Boxes to be playing Drapion. The only exception would be if I started to see things like Energy Recyclers, and then I'd expect Kyogre instead. So either way, you know that Lost Box is going to have some sort of tricks for you, because they usually need that edge to win out the matchup. So that's my personal expectation. There's still a good chance that Giratina's, like Lost Box players, also play Spiritomb. There's a decent chance some Gardevoirs do as well. I think that's a lot less guaranteed, but if you want to have have the worst case scenario, test against the Arceus decks with the Tomb, test against the Lost Boxes with the Drapion. That's got to be something that you got to do and figure out how bad those matchups are, even when they are playing those tech cards, because there are still ways you can get around it. The other thing I would bear in mind is that your positive matchups aren't really good. The spread for Mew isn't fantastic. Unless you think there's going to be a massive spike in popularity of the Rapid Strike Urshifu deck, I don't think your positive matchups are going to be all that popular. You may hit them once in the day, you may not hit them at all in Day 1 of Worlds. So with my metagaming cap on, I feel like the things that you're more likely to face in the Day 1 of the World Championships, these are actually the harder matchups. They're all like even at best. So yes, you can win out, but it probably means you're going to have good variance, and that even matchup can be reduced based on their tech inclusions. So that's a little bit concerning from me from a metagame perspective of Mew. I think it gets caught a little bit in the crossfire of people wanting dark type coverage for Guardy already. It gets caught in a little bit of the crossfire of everyone wanting Path already in their decks and stuff like that. So Mew's just not in the best place it's been for a little while, in my opinion. What I will say in favor of Mew, though, is that it's a really well-ironed, established archetype at this point. You know, we've been talking about Mew since last Worlds. It's been a very well-established archetype for the longest time, and we know that if it does get those high rolls and your opponent doesn't have stellar starts, sometimes you get instant, immediate wins just because you got your Sparkle combo off and blow someone up straight away and the opponent has no response. So I feel like you are playing a really consistent list and punish the inconsistencies of what is the format. And that sort of leads into the second point, is that just drawing better than people allows you to do some crazy things that many people just can't bounce back from at times. You can get some massive KOs, you can deny prizes with your Psychic Leaps at times, you can really just, there's a lot of room to maneuver and outplay people with Mew because you can just draw all of these unlikely combinations and make it happen pretty consistently. So I do think there's still a lot of merits around the Mew archetype, just in that you're just a very powerful 60 cards and you still ask a lot of questions of opponents, especially because of how consistently, even with just one Iona, one Judge, one Path in the deck, that you do pull off those late game swings and ask the question on the exact turn, and if they don't have the answers, they're going to lose immediately next turn, just because that's how Mew functions. It can then draw its next 20 cards in the deck to close out the game, no matter what those cards are. Let me know your thoughts on Mew for the World Championships. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow in another video. Cheers.